In my last video, I showed you how I built this drawer cabinet for my home office. I'll be making a modular desk system where I'll build 2 of these base cabinets and add a solid wood top to turn it into a desk. Now, as you can see, the cabinet is currently unfinished plywood, so today I'm going to walk you through my finishing process. Now, sure, painting furniture is a pretty straightforward process, so today I want to focus on 2 key things. Number 1, that's how to prep your plywood edges to get a nice, smooth, silky finish when painting. And number 2, it's how to finish the inside of your drawers. Now, the one thing I hate about homemade furniture is how rough and unfinished that drawers look. You can see the exposed edges of the plywood, and it's just rough to the touch. So what I did for this cabinet is I actually pre-finished all the drawer parts before assembly to make them look like solid lumber and nice and smooth to the touch to give them a really professional look. So today I'm going to walk you through that process. Let's get to it. The truth is that my cabinet has been sitting in my garage untouched for almost 3 weeks now, waiting to be finished. It's just been too cold to work in here, and way too cold to apply finish. But I decided enough is enough and headed over to Princess Auto to pick up a new space heater to help warm things up. I cranked it up and could finally get back to work. Now, usually you want to finish your cabinet before assembly, but I wanted to break down this project into 2 videos, first showing you how the cabinet is built and then the finishing process, which means I now have to take the cabinet apart. Of course, I don't need to completely take it apart. I'm just going to remove the drawers and then remove the handles and detach the drawer fronts from the drawer boxes so I can paint them. By the way, it's a good idea to label your drawer boxes top, middle, bottom so you don't mix them up later, and the same goes for drawer fronts. I'm going to need to sand, prep, and paint, and I don't want all that getting into my drawer slides, so here I'm adding some painter's tape to protect the front edges. My first focus is to smooth out all the exposed plywood edges. If you just paint these as is, it'll look horrible, so I'll start by sanding them just a little to smooth them out, making sure to break all the edges so they don't fray later on. To fill and smooth out the edge grain, I'm going to use DAP's Premium Wood Filler, which is great as a grain filler among other things. DAP has a line of wood fillers to choose from for various applications, and you can check those out using the link down in the description below. Applying the filler was a little awkward for me at first. You can tell I've never done drywall before, but eventually I got the hang of it with a little practice. My goal is to get a thin, uniform layer to cover all the end grain. If you put on too little, the grain will show through, but if you put on too much, well, you'll have a lot more sanding to do later, so the trick is trying to find the right balance. I paid extra attention to any voids in the plies, making sure to fill those and leave a little overfill. I covered all 4 edges of my drawer fronts and the exposed edges of the cabinet too. Of course, I tried to get it as perfect and clean as possible, but it's okay if it's not perfect on the first try, as you can always come back and hit it with a second coat. I decided to let my first coat dry for 2 hours and then use some 180 grit paper to sand down the wood filler. I quickly realized that using my orbital sander on the edges was much too aggressive, even at the lowest speed setting, so I switched to my micro sanding block with 220 grit paper. I started by sanding all the edges using a really light touch until the edges were smooth, being careful not to remove all the filler. I could then flip over the cabinet and go back to my orbital sander to sand down all of my plywood surfaces and eliminate any fuzzies. There's no need to overdo it here, just a few passes, and stop when it's smooth to the touch. I repeated the same for all the drawer fronts using the lowest speed setting for the faces, then switching to the sanding block for the edges and sanding lightly until it was nice and smooth. When all the sanding was said and done, I ended up with white powder everywhere, which could be a real nightmare when painting. So, to avoid ending up with grainy paint, I used a damp cloth to wipe down all the surfaces and remove the dust, being careful not to overdo it and wipe away the wood filler because, warning, it's water soluble. Okay, so while I let that dry, I can get set up to start painting, and I'll start with a coat of primer. This is the primer I've decided to use, but whatever you choose, just make sure it's recommended for bare wood surfaces, like this one. Here I'm using a foam roller to apply a coat of primer to the drawer fronts and the edges. Now yes, I do have a paint sprayer, but it's too cold outside and I don't like to spray indoors. It can be tempting to skip the primer, but it's an important step for 2 reasons. First, it helps seal the wood so it won't show through your paint. And if you've ever patched a hole in the wall, then painted it without using primer, you'll know exactly what I mean. And second, the primer allows you to notice any defects in the surfaces that you can fix before moving on. I let it dry for the recommended time and then inspected the edges and wasn't surprised to find a few spots that needed repair. I did a quick touch-up and spot prime before moving on to the next step. Once dry, you'll notice the primer is really rugged to the touch, and I know no one wants to hear it, but sanding is really the key to a smooth paint job. Again, using the power sander on the edges will likely remove more paint than you want, so I stuck with hand sanding the edges. Just as before, it's important to wipe off any powder residue so it doesn't affect the smoothness of the next coat of paint. For the top coat, I'm using this cabinet paint. Now, I'm no expert on paint, but what I can tell you is that you don't want to use latex paint for cabinets. It's just not durable enough. You want to look for alkyd paint, which will often say cabinet or enamel on the label. Initially, I was going to use this paint, but another one caught my eye at the store, maybe because of the mention of premium on the label, I don't know, but mainly because it's a cabinet paint that dries in 2 hours, which makes it easier to apply multiple coats in a single day. And by the way, these are all water-based paints. You'll actually see that I ran into some issues with this paint, and I don't know if the paint was the issue or not, but just FYI, my research also pointed to 2 other good cabinet paint options, which are Sherwin-Williams Pro Classic or Benjamin Moore Advance, if you want to check those out. I applied a coat of paint, being careful not to press too hard so I didn't get any roller lines and such, and trying to get a really uniform coverage, but I quickly realized that I was getting a really bumpy finish, which upon closer inspection appeared to be tiny bubbles in the paint. I decided to let it dry, hoping the paint would do its thing and even out as it dried, but I was horrified to see all the small craters and bubbles after it had dried. I figured, okay, this is just the first coat, let's just sand it out, and the second coat will smooth everything out. This time I moved up to 320 grit paper and lightly sanded all the surfaces again, and wiped away the dust, then got to work on the second coat. Sadly, after it had dried, the result was exactly the same. This sucks! All this prep work only to end up with such an ugly finish? I don't think so. I could only assume that the foam roller was the issue. This paint is so thin and fluid like water that the foam roller must be making it bubble up. After some research, it seemed that the best solution was to try a woven 6mm nap roller rather than the foam roller. So after sanding it again and wiping it all down, I applied a third coat using this new roller. While we let that dry and hope for the best, let's talk about finishing the inside of cabinet drawers. Now here's a good example of what I don't want. Sure, having exposed rough plywood is fine for your shop drawers, but I want the stuff inside my house to look a little more professional, you know? The first step to finishing drawers, and this should all be done before you assemble them, is to add edge banding to the top of the drawer parts. This was actually my first time using iron-on edge banding, but it seems pretty straightforward. I cut a piece slightly longer than required and set my iron to the hottest setting. It took me a few tries to get a feel for it, but essentially you want to move the iron slowly, keeping it flat, spending maybe 10 seconds per area until the glue melts and it sticks on. Too long and you'll notice burn marks on your edge banding. Too fast and it'll tend to peel up. I used this edge band roller to ensure it had good contact all along the edges and then set the piece aside to cool and let the glue dry. You may have noticed that if you don't have a vise, you can use a pair of parallel clamps to hold the piece in place while you work. Once all the pieces had cooled, I set the piece back in the clamps and used this edge band trimmer to cut off the excess, and then clip the ends with some scissors. I'll leave a link to this tool down below if you want to check it out. Now, I've heard some people say they prefer to use another method because the tool can cause some tearing. My first few were perfect, and then I did experience some tearing on a few, but ultimately I was able to sand it out so it wasn't noticeable. It also helps to use a file to flush up the extremities. I sanded the edges using 220 grit, making sure to remove any visible adhesive or any excess edge banding until everything was flush and smooth. Ultimately, when you're done, your plywood should look almost like a solid piece of wood. Now, apparently you can buy pre-finished plywood that's finished on one side, but I've never come across it where I live, so I'm going to pre-finish it myself. For this, I'll be using 2 products, shellac and water-based polyurethane. I'll leave links down below. The first step is to seal the plywood using 1 coat of shellac, ideally using a natural bristle paintbrush. Shellac dries really fast, so you can flip it over and do the other side quickly without forgetting to coat the finished edge too. After about an hour or two, shellac can already be sanded using 320 grit paper. I'm just hitting it lightly to knock out any imperfections and make it smooth to the touch. Typically, once the sheen is gone, it pretty much means it's done. I wipe down all the pieces with a slightly damp cloth to remove any dust left behind by the sanding, and then applied a single coat of water-based poly to all the drawer sides and the bottoms too. I personally like using a foam brush for this to apply an even thin coat. And that's it! Once dry, you'll have silky smooth drawer parts that are ready for assembly. The plywood is soft to the touch and looks like solid wood. If you want to see how I made the drawers and install them in the cabinet, just click the link in the top right corner to check out that video. And now's the moment of truth. Back to the cabinet paint to see what kind of finish we have. Well, the 6mm nap roller was definitely an improvement over the foam roller, but it still has a few bubbles and an orange peel texture. I definitely do not recommend this paint. On the other hand, what I do highly recommend is DAP's Premium Wood Filler. It really made the plywood edges disappear and was so easy to work with. This is the back of the cabinet where I didn't use the wood filler, just for reference. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to check out my previous video where I built this drawer cabinet, and stay tuned for my upcoming video where I'll be turning this cabinet into a modular desk. So be sure to subscribe if you want to follow along. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.